All right, so for part two of this video, it's really focusing on the creation of rubrics. So in stage two, we talked about evaluating student learning. We talked about the different criteria you could use. Now the question becomes, how does that become objective or subjective? And is it okay to have things that are subjective versus objective? And by objective, we're talking about things that would be in math, 4 plus 4 is 8. That's objective. Whereas in language arts, you might say, what's the theme of the book? And students might give you a similar theme, but it's up to you to decide if it's correct or not. And so oftentimes we think about rubrics being that link between subjective and objective learning. And so with rubrics, there are several different types. We talked about proficiency scales. Most of us have seen a traditional rubric that comes in a chart form where it has the behaviors or the what you're doing down the side, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across the top, similar to what you see in your college courses. And so I guess it's important to talk about another type of rubric that's called a checklist, which would just be a 1 through 5 on things like originality, or you could even have them on things like understanding and knowledge. But to truly assess a student, it's best to use a rubric. And so, like I mentioned before, checklists are sometimes okay to use if you're ranging of performances. So something like on a music scale. Maybe you're saying something like, uh, maybe you're teaching the trumpet and you're talking about fingering for the different notes, right? Are they pushing the right buttons on the trumpet? And you might have a range, well, they hardly ever know what it is, so it's a 1. They always get the right finger positions and push the right valves down. That's a 10. Those kind of things. But when you have a checklist, you can only include a handful of criteria and criteria-based questions. It's also important to know that your criteria needs to be measurable and teachable. So you shouldn't teach things that you can't measure, and you shouldn't measure things that you're not teaching. And so those need to connect, and usually that's done with a rubric. Criteria should be stated concise and clear, and make sure you're sharing it with them. That's the point of a learning target or an essential question, is to truly let students know what the expectations are. Now, with rubrics, there are two classical approaches. You have the holistic approach, which looks at the big picture, looks at one overall score, looks at the whole is greater than the sum. That might be an example, might be something where you're looking at an essay. You're writing a whole essay, so you're not breaking it down into subcategories. You're looking just at the essay as a whole. Then you have this analytical part, and this is where we talk about it's broken into subparts. It provides specific feedback on different sections, can be broken down into learning targets or learning goals. This is where standards-based grading is progressing and making teachers progress in the way they assess things in an analytical sort of form. An example might be that maybe you have 3 standards you're assessing on a test, and each of your essay questions addresses a different standard. Now, a few years ago, I may have said, okay, each one's worth 10 points. I'm looking at it out of 30. You got 25 out of 30. Good job. Now we're looking at it as, well, out of 10, what did you get? And now on that proficiency scale, did you get a 1, a 2, a 2.5, a 3, and so forth? And so that's what the analytical breakdown of a rubric does. Now, when you develop rubrics, I'm sure we've all done these in the past. When creating rubrics, it's important that your rubric assesses not only what you're teaching, but also what the standards are that you're looking at or what your learning targets are. And so you want to think about what those essential questions are on a whole, and then how does that learning target of that specific unit or whatever you're assessing break down? So, for example, an oral presentation might be rated for content, organization, delivery, and language. Um, be sure that your criteria are explicit and measurable. Neatness would not be a good criterion because the term neat is not explicit enough. And what truly is neatness? And like we've talked about before, if you're in a standards-based or a standards reference school district, the fact that you would even put neatness on a rubric doesn't exist. The idea of taking behavior out of grading so that that grade actually measures their knowledge or their understanding is truly the most important part of a rubric. And giving the idea of things like, if you're giving a rubric for a project, let's say your project is on The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and maybe you want students to compare, Ichabod Crane with in the book versus the Disney movie. And so you say something along the lines of what are the characteristics of Ichabod that are showcased following the party at the Van Tassels? That's explicit, it's measurable, it truly points at what you want the student to learn and what you want the student to be able to do in terms of that strategy. So that's an example of something that would be more explicit and measurable. So we'll just kind of run through some steps here that will hopefully guide you in developing some rubrics. And if you're somebody that develops rubrics all the time, this might be a nice review for you. If you're somebody who has never developed a rubric, this hopefully will guide you in the right direction. And if you need extra help, don't hesitate to email or jump on the Zoom on Sunday nights from 8 to 8:30, and we can definitely talk through that. So with your rubric, you want to start with the poles of your rubric, so the important parts. So what does expert, what's the performance that we're looking for? Or a perfect project look like? What does it mean if you're an SBG or an SRG school and you're using a scale like Gusky would say of 1 to 4? What's a 4 look like? What's a 1 look like? And that's where you start to build your rubric. So this is what the 1, the 0, however you want to look at it looks like. Here's what the perfect, the 4, the 5, whatever you're looking at goes into. And then how do things fit in between? And on what level are you looking at? 2, you want to take a look and you want to actually write out, it says articulate gradations of quality, but what are those levels? So what's a 1 look like? What's a 5 look like? We've established that. But then how do those things look in the center? What does it mean to be a 3 or right in the middle? And those kind of things you want to start. And what's the student doing? What's the accepted knowledge level in that part? What's the struggling part? What's the best part? Where do we fit on that spectrum? And usually 3 to 4 levels of performance is best. I tend to build my rubrics on a 1 to 5 scale. Now that I've gone to SRG, I tend to do a 1 to 4 scale. And then the expectations down the side, things like connection to history, development of thesis statement, those real specific kind of things that allow you to use your rubric on multiple assessments and in multiple content points, but to be specific enough. So like we talked about before, examples of polls, things like perfect might be something like a sharply focused thesis statement. Something that's unsuccessful on that other end, or usually the left-hand side of your paper, would be they don't even have a thesis statement. So it's the extremes. What's it look like to be perfect? What's it look like to not have those? And then just some ideas for creating rubrics, kind of the cheat sheet part of this. Don't have a 0 as a category. Start with 1. Matching scores, passing a 5 or 6 point scale. Like I said, I like to use, before I went to SRG, Standards Reference Grading, I did a 1 to 5 so that I had a 3 as a middle ground. Now I do a 1 to 4, but I have my 2.5, 3, 3.5. So it's still on a 5 different categories. Start with the best on the left side or the right side. It doesn't really matter. Depends on how you want to do that. For best practices, it talks about having it on the left. I've always done it on the right. It doesn't really matter where you put that, as long as when you're explaining to students that it's consistent, right? It's always on the right-hand side or it's always on the left-hand side. You want to have a continuous scale, so don't go 1, 3, 5. You'd want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or if your standards reference 1, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, depending upon what your district is requiring you to do. And then proportionately, you want it to reflect the importance of what that half point difference is. And this is no different when you're creating a rubric and a proficiency scale, which I'll talk a little bit about later in the course. But how do you use those? How do you use that to help students understand that these are the things you're being graded on? This is how I'm measuring or evaluating you. And to give them enough points that they can be focused, their work can be sharp, it can truly show you what they understand or know, versus them just taking a shot in the dark. And oftentimes you'll see teachers write something on the board, write me a 3-page paper on Martin Luther King, and the I Have a Dream speech. Ready, set, go. There's no rubric, there's no guidance. Think about how frustrating it is as a college student or a graduate student to get an assignment and not have a rubric and not understand what the expectations are. Imagine that now as a middle school or an elementary school student. And oftentimes, if you're talking a rubric with kindergartners, you're going to explain to them what you want them to do, but you're going to do it in kindergarten-friendly language. Your rubric might be full of I can statements. So at the very far right might be the highest of the high thing you're doing, and on the left is the low, but it's not going to say, I can't do this. It might say something like, I can count to 5, and maybe you're wanting them to be able to do something where it's demonstrating the understanding of numbers. So maybe on the far left it says, I can identify single-digit numbers. And maybe on the far right, even though you haven't taught it, which would be the perfect part of it, I can identify all double-digit numbers, or all the double-digit numbers 10 to 20, or whatever you're looking at. So those are some important parts of creating rubrics and creating proficiency scales. And like I said, I'll talk a little more about that in the upcoming weeks, but the most important part of creating a rubric is expectations and understanding. Making sure that you're clear, and I've talked with several of my peer coaches about this, crystal clear. You want to make sure that there is no question about what the expectations are, what the expected learning is, and where the grade will fall within those sort of things. And it goes back to what I started with by saying objective versus subjective. Rubrics allow subjective sort of questions, those deeper, higher level questions, to be assessed with a subjective point of view, but giving it an objective point value. So these are the expectations to get a 1. These are the expectations to get 2. These are the expectations to get 3. So within that, it gives the teacher a little bit of wiggle room on, yeah, that's real close to that 3 we're looking for, or man, that's not anywhere near. But at the same time, it gives the student the understanding to say something like, if I can get close enough to this, if I can go down this path the correct way, then the teacher is going to say, you're starting to understand that. It really creates and opens a dialogue, and that's what rubrics are meant to do. Not only grade and allow you to assess a student's understanding, but also give students a chance to be autonomous in their own learning, to show that they are understanding something, and then to be able to ask questions and get help if they need it. So in closing, I just want to give you a kind of a sample writing rubric here. And if you look down the left-hand side, it has things like purpose, development, details, organization. And across the top, it has 0, 1, 2, 3. So as you can see across the top here, essential elements, 0, 1, 2, 3. And as we mentioned before, oftentimes we would slide that 0 off and start here in the left column with a 1, and then a 2, and then a 3, and a 4. But you can see how it goes from what's the very worst, lowest, whatever expectation here, totally lacking purpose, to what's the highest expectation, purpose is clearly expressed. And so as you develop your rubric, that's what you want to be thinking about, is what's the top of the top? What's the very best gold standard I'm expecting? And then on the other side of it, what is the very worst? What's the worst thing that someone could do? And when you talk about it, you kind of look through these, that's where we're getting at with rubrics, is making sure that it's clear and students understand it, but also clear that in your assessment, you understand it. So when you make that assessment and you go and look back through it, you say, oh, this person understands thesis statements or purpose, but man, they definitely didn't understand how to develop it. So they had a purpose that was clearly expressed, but they had inappropriate responses to the thesis, or it didn't match up. And now you can go back and in your MTSS and your RTI time, in that differentiated time, you can work on these different skills. That allows you to build a deeper understanding with the student, and also allows you to connect better with your students, and allows you to have a strong talking point when you're working with them in the MTSS process, when you're working with them in the process of helping them understand things in class, differentiate your instruction. It also gives you a chance to see, is there one skill set that everybody's missing? And then you can go back and reteach that. So I just want to close by showing you this sample rubric. And if you have any questions about rubrics or writing rubrics, don't hesitate to ask. I have a lot of examples of rubrics I can send out. I also have some proficiency scales, and I also have some checklists. So if you have any questions, please ask. I did a lot of those with special education. I've got several with social studies. When I say several, I mean probably 100 or so. So please ask, and I'd be happy to share those with you. And enjoy the rest of week 3, and I look forward to hopefully talking with some of you on Zoom about some of these things. Thanks.